The first thing I remember about that morning is the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand before the sun was fully up. Not ringing, just vibrating, like it didn't want to wake anyone else in the house, like it already knew it was bringing bad news. I let it buzz longer than I should have. I was 32 years old, living alone in a rented townhouse just outside Savannah, Georgia, and yet my body still reacted to family messages the same way it had when I was a teenager living under my parents' roof. Tight chest, shallow breath, that quiet instinct to brace myself before even reading the words. When I finally picked it up, I saw the family group chat lighting up. My mother's name, my younger sisters, my uncle, my older cousin who only spoke when something serious was happening. The message was short. "We need to talk today. Please come by the house this afternoon. It's about the estate." The estate. Those two words landed heavier than they should have. My grandmother Eleanor had passed away 3 weeks earlier. Peacefully, they said. In her sleep in the big white colonial house she'd lived in for over 40 years. The house I used to escape to when my parents' home felt too loud, too cold, too conditional. The house where someone always listened. I sat up in bed, pulling the sheet tighter around myself, even though the room wasn't cold. I already knew what this was about, or at least I thought I did. I had always been told the will was simple. Everything would be divided fairly. That was the word my mother liked to use, fairly. As if fairness was something you could just declare without ever proving it. I replied with one word, "Okay?" I spent the rest of the morning moving slowly. Coffee tasted flat. The shower felt too hot. Every small task stretched longer than it needed to, like my body was buying time before the inevitable. On the drive over, I passed streets I knew by heart. Spanish moss hanging low from oak trees. The old bakery on the corner where my grandmother used to stop for pecan tarts on Sundays. Every detail felt sharper, heavier, like my mind was already mourning something I hadn't officially lost yet. My parents' house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. Brick exterior, perfect lawn. The same house I grew up in where nothing was ever technically wrong, but nothing was ever safe either. I parked behind my sister's car and sat there for a moment with the engine off, hands resting in my lap. I told myself this was just paperwork, just legal formalities. I told myself families don't do cruel things on purpose. They just make choices and pretend not to see who gets hurt. When I walked inside, everyone was already there. My mother sat at the dining table with her back straight, hands folded neatly, like she was waiting for a business meeting to start. My father stood near the window, staring outside, as if he might escape through the glass. My sister Claire leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone, perfectly calm. My uncle Robert was there too, which immediately set something off in my chest. He never came around unless money was involved. They all looked up when I entered. My mother smiled first, not warm, polite, controlled. "You're here. Good, sit down." I took the chair in the far end of the table, the same one I always ended up in. The observer's seat, the one slightly out of alignment with the rest. No one offered me coffee, no one asked how I was doing. That was the first sign. My uncle cleared his throat and slid a folder across the table. Thick, legal thick. "This is the finalized will," he said. "Everything has been processed through the attorney. We're just here to go over the outcomes as a family." Outcomes. Not decisions, not choices. Outcomes. Like this had all happened naturally without human hands guiding it. I opened the folder slowly. My grandmother's name was printed at the top in bold letters. Eleanor May Collins. The woman who taught me how to balance a checkbook, how to trust my instincts, how to sit quietly, and let other people reveal who they were. I skimmed the pages at first, expecting to see what I'd always been told. The house divided, savings split, a few sentimental items listed out. But the words didn't line up with that expectation. The house was left entirely to my sister. The investment accounts went to my parents. Several smaller assets were distributed among extended relatives. And me. I kept scanning, certain I had missed something. There it was, finally, my name. A one-time cash distribution. A fraction of what the house alone was worth. No explanation, no personal note, no mention of the years I spent caring for her after her surgery, the weekends I gave up, the calls I answered when no one else did. I felt the room tilt slightly. I looked up slowly, meeting my mother's eyes. "This can't be right," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. My mother exhaled like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. Your grandmother made her choices very carefully, she said. She wanted to keep the house in the family. I'm in the family, I said. My sister finally looked up from her phone. Of course you are, she said lightly. But you live so far away now, it just made sense. Made sense. That phrase again. The one they used whenever something hurt me but benefited them. I turned to my uncle. Was there any amendment? Any letter? Anything explaining this? He shook his head. The will is very clear, legally sound. There's nothing to contest here. My father still hadn't turned around. I felt something shift inside me then. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. Something quieter. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't confusion. This was a decision that had been discussed, justified, and finalized without me in the room. I closed the folder carefully and placed it back on the table. So that's it, I said. That's what she wanted. My mother nodded quickly, relief flickering across her face like she was glad I hadn't raised my voice. We knew you'd understand. You've always been independent. Independent. Another word they like to use. It sounded like praise, but it was really a way to explain why I was always the one excluded. I stood up slowly. I need some air. No one stopped me. I walked out of the house and stood on the front porch, the late afternoon sun pressing down on my shoulders. My hands were shaking now, but my mind was clear in a way it hadn't been in years. They thought this was over. They thought I would accept it quietly the way I always had. But as I stood there staring at the familiar street, one truth settled deep in my chest. This wasn't just about inheritance. This was about control. And for the first time in my life, I was done pretending not to see it. I didn't drive home right away. I sat in my car with the engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel, like it was the only thing keeping me anchored. The house loomed in my rearview mirror, neat and quiet, exactly the same as it had always been. No sign that anything inside had just shifted permanently. My phone buzzed again. A text from my mother. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. We did what your grandmother would have wanted. I didn't respond. I had learned over time that explanations were not invitations to understand. They were tools, and my family used them to keep things exactly as they liked them. I drove instead toward the river, the long way past streets where no one knew my name or my history. I needed space. Not to cry. I wasn't there yet. I needed space to think without their voices pressing in from all directions. Because the more I replayed the scene at the table, the more something felt wrong. My grandmother was many things. Private, careful, traditional in some ways. But she was not careless, and she was not cruel. She believed in preparation. In notes, in contingency plans. She believed people should never be left guessing when it came to matters that could divide families. And yet, according to them, she had left me almost nothing. No explanation, no acknowledgement, just a quiet erasure. That didn't match the woman I knew. By the time I got home, the sun was starting to dip, staining the sky with streaks of orange and gray. I kicked off my shoes and stood in the kitchen without turning on the lights. The silence felt thick but honest. No polite smiles, no careful wording, just me and my thoughts. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the small table by the window. My hands had stopped shaking. That scared me more than if they hadn't. I pulled the folder back out of my bag and went through it again, this time slower. Not as a granddaughter, as an adult. There were signatures, dates, legal language, everything looked clean. Too clean. But then I noticed something small. The attorney's name? I frowned. It wasn't the lawyer my grandmother had used for years. The man whose office smelled like old books and lemon polish. The one she trusted enough to handle her affairs after my grandfather died. This was someone else. Someone new. I set the papers down and stared at the wall. That was the first crack. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was upset exactly, but because my mind wouldn't stop lining things up. Moments, conversations, little comments that hadn't meant much at the time. My mother insisting on handling my grandmother's mail after her stroke. My sister moving into the house temporarily to help out. My uncle suddenly appearing more often, bringing documents offering to simplify things. At the time, it had all been framed as support. Now it felt like something else. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I made coffee and sat at my desk, laptop open, staring at the search bar longer than necessary before typing the attorney's name. The firm came up immediately. Mid-sized, aggressive marketing, estate planning specialists. I clicked through their site, reading between the lines. They talked a lot about efficiency, about minimizing disputes, about streamlined processes. I picked up the phone and dialed. After a brief hold, a receptionist answered. Bright voice, professional. I asked carefully whether the firm had handled the estate of Eleanor May Collins. There was a pause. May I ask who's calling? I gave my name. Another pause, longer this time. One moment, please. The line went quiet. Not the soft hold music from before, just silence. Then a different voice came on. Male, measured. This is Daniel Hargrove. How can I help you? I explained who I was. I kept my tone neutral. I asked whether there had been any correspondence attached to the will. Letters, instructions, notes. I could almost hear him choosing his words. All communications were handled through the appointed executor, he said, which was, your mother, Miss Collins. There it was. I thanked him and hung up before my voice could change. I sat back in my chair and let out a slow breath. So my mother had been the gatekeeper, the filter, the one who decided what was shared and what wasn't. I wasn't surprised, but I wasn't done. That afternoon, I drove to my grandmother's house for the first time since the reading. My sister's car was gone. Good. I didn't need an audience. I let myself in with the spare key I'd had since college. The house smelled the same. Lavender cleaner, old wood, time. I walked through, slowly touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the piano she never learned to play properly but loved anyway. Everything felt suspended, like it was waiting for someone to tell it what it was allowed to remember. In the hallway closet behind coats that weren't used anymore, I found the small metal lockbox she kept important things in. She had shown it to me once years ago with a half smile. Just in case, she'd said, people forget who they are when money shows up. I knelt on the floor and opened it. Inside were old deeds, insurance papers, birth certificates, and at the bottom a sealed envelope. My name was written on the front in her careful handwriting. My chest tightened. I sat back on my heels, holding it like it might disappear if I moved too fast. They had said there was nothing else. They had looked me in the eye and said she left no explanation. My hands were steady as I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, several pages folded neatly. I didn't read it all at once. I had to stop after the first paragraph because my throat closed up. She wrote about watching the family change after my grandfather died. About how people talked about responsibility when they really meant control. About how she worried certain voices would always be louder than others. Then she wrote about me. She wrote that I was the one who never asked for permission. The one who showed up without being told. The one who listened. She wrote that she trusted me. And then she wrote the sentence that changed everything. I have made arrangements to protect what is mine until the right moment. If you are reading this, it means the others were not ready to be honest with you. My pulse thudded in my ears. I turned the page. She explained that the house and assets listed in the will were only part of the picture. That years earlier she had placed several properties and accounts into a separate trust, one that could only be accessed under specific conditions. Conditions that required transparency, consent, and the absence of coercion. She had anticipated this. She had planned for it, and she had left the key with me. I sat there on the floor of the hallway, letter shaking slightly in my hands, and felt something settle into place. This wasn't just betrayal. This was exposure. They hadn't just excluded me. They had tried to control the outcome, and now I had proof that the story they told me at that table was incomplete. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I stood up, locked the box, and slid it back into place. Then I took out my phone and searched for a lawyer of my own. Not to argue, not to plead, but to make sure the truth once revealed could no longer be managed without my consent. By the time I left the house, the sun was low again, casting long shadows across the lawn. They thought the conversation was over. In reality, it had just begun. I didn't tell anyone about the letter. Not my parents, not my sister, not even the cousin who liked to whisper warnings. I understood instinctively that once the truth left my mouth, it would stop being mine to control. And control for the first time mattered. Instead, I made an appointment. Her name was Margaret Hale. Estate litigation, 25 years in practice. Her office sat in a converted townhouse near downtown, the kind of place that smelled faintly of old paper and strong coffee. When I walked in, no one rushed me. No one smiled too much. That alone felt like a relief. Margaret read the letter twice without speaking. Her expression didn't change, but her pen stopped moving. This, she said, finally tapping the page gently, is not sentimental writing. This is contingency planning. I told her everything. The reading of the will, the attorney switch, my mother's role as executor, the envelope hidden in the lockbox. I didn't embellish. I didn't editorialize. I stuck to facts. That helped more than emotion ever could. Margaret leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. Your grandmother anticipated coercion, she said. Possibly undue influence. This trust she describes, if it exists and is valid, supersedes the will in very specific ways. If it exists, I said. She nodded. That's the key. We need to find it before they move to consolidate assets. That sentence landed hard. They were already acting, I realized. Already assuming the story was finished. Already rearranging their lives around an outcome that depended on my silence. Margaret outlined the process calmly. No courtroom dramatics. No confrontations unless necessary. First, we would file a request for disclosure related to any trusts established in my grandmother's name. That alone would freeze certain transactions. They won't like that, she added. I didn't answer. I wasn't doing this to be liked. The letter stayed in my bag as I left her office. It felt heavier now, but also steadier, like an anchor. That evening, my sister called. I watched the phone ring until it stopped. Then it rang again and again. Finally, a text. Why are you making this difficult? Mom is upset. You should have talked to us before going to the house. So they knew. Of course they did. Someone had noticed the lockbox, or the door opening, or maybe they'd simply assumed I would snoop. They'd underestimated me in many ways over the years, but never my quiet persistence. I replied with one sentence. I'm allowed to ask questions. The response came quickly. This isn't about questions, it's about respect. I stared at the screen. Respect in my family had always flowed in one direction, downward, from the people who decided to the people who adapted. I put the phone face down and went to bed early. 2 days later, Margaret called. We found it. The trust existed. Multiple properties. Accounts held separately. Structured carefully. Updated 3 years ago, shortly after my grandmother's stroke. And there was more. A clause. In the event of misrepresentation or concealment of material information related to the estate, the trust assets would be redistributed. My name appeared again, not as a default beneficiary, as a decision maker. I closed my eyes as she spoke. This wasn't revenge. This was foresight. Your grandmother didn't just want to protect assets, Margaret said. She wanted to protect you from being sidelined. That night I slept deeply for the first time since the funeral. The next week, the tone in the family group chat shifted. Where there had once been polite firmness, there was now unease. My uncle asked if I'd found anything interesting at the house. My mother suggested we all have dinner together and clear the air. My sister sent a message that simply said, we need to talk like adults. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I signed paperwork. The request for disclosure went out quietly, officially. No accusations, just procedure. Within 48 hours, the first crack showed. My mother called. Not texted, called. Her voice was tight. Why is a lawyer contacting me about your grandmother's finances? I kept my voice level. Because I have questions. You should have come to me first. I paused. You were already in charge, I said. That didn't seem to help. Silence. Then her tone softened just slightly. We were trying to protect the family. There it was, the same phrase, over and over. I ended the call politely. A week later, Margaret forwarded me an email exchange between the attorneys. My mother's lawyer was requesting delays, clarifications, extensions. The trust was real, but it had conditions they hadn't met. They hadn't disclosed it at the reading of the will. They hadn't informed all interested parties. They had acted as if it didn't exist. And now legally that mattered. Margaret explained it carefully. Intent is difficult to prove. Action is not. The omission itself triggers review. I pictured my mother at the dining table, the way she folded her hands, the certainty in her voice. We knew you'd understand. What she meant was we knew you wouldn't fight. That assumption was unraveling. The night before the formal mediation was scheduled, my sister showed up at my door. I hadn't told her where I lived. She must have asked my parents. She stood on the porch with her arms crossed, eyes sharp. You blindsided us, she said. I didn't invite her in. I asked for transparency, I said. She scoffed. You always twist things. You're making this into something ugly. I looked at her carefully, really looked. She wasn't angry because I'd hurt her. She was angry because the ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. This isn't about the house, she said. It's about trust. I nodded once. Yes, it is. She left without another word. Inside, I locked the door and leaned against it, breathing slowly. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't afraid. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was responding. The mediation was scheduled for the following week. Documents were moving, timelines tightening, stories adjusting. They were preparing to explain themselves, and I was preparing to listen. Not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as the person my grandmother had trusted to see the truth clearly, even when everyone else chose convenience. The next chapter wouldn't be loud, but it would be decisive. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, which felt intentional in a way I couldn't quite explain. Tuesdays aren't dramatic. They don't carry the emotional weight of Mondays or the anticipation of Fridays. They sit quietly in the middle of things, pretending not to matter while everything shifts around them. I arrived early. The conference room was neutral to the point of erasure. Beige walls. A long table polished so often it had lost its shine. A pitcher of water no one ever finished. This wasn't a place for raised voices or slammed doors. This was where people rewrote history carefully, sentence by sentence. Margaret arrived a few minutes after I did, carrying a slim folder, and the kind of calm that only comes from having seen families tear themselves apart without flinching. "You don't need to speak unless you want to," she reminded me quietly. "Let them talk first." That was fine with me. My parents arrived together. My mother held her purse like a shield. My father walked half a step behind her eyes, scanning the room as if looking for an exit. My sister came in alone, heels sharp against the floor, posture rigid. No one smiled. The mediator introduced himself, explained the rules, the goals: neutrality, transparency, resolution. Then my mother spoke. She framed everything as misunderstanding, stress, grief. She talked about how hard it had been managing things after my grandmother's stroke, how overwhelming the paperwork was, how she thought she was doing the right thing. Margaret listened without interrupting. My sister spoke next. Her voice was controlled but tight. She said she felt attacked, that she had moved into the house to help, that the suggestion of wrongdoing was hurtful. My father said very little, just enough to agree without committing. Then the mediator turned to Margaret. She slid one document across the table. "This is the trust agreement established by Eleanor Collins 3 years prior to her passing." The room went still. My mother's hand tightened around her purse. Margaret continued, her voice even. "This trust was not disclosed during the will reading. It contains assets not addressed in the will. It also contains conditions regarding disclosure and representation." She looked directly at my mother. Those conditions were not met. My mother opened her mouth and closed it. The mediator leaned forward. "Is that accurate?" My mother nodded slowly. "We didn't think it was necessary," she said. "The will covered most things." Margaret didn't react. "The trust states otherwise," she said. "It explicitly requires disclosure to all named parties. Failure to do so triggers a review of executor authority." My sister leaned forward. "So what?" she said sharply. "You're saying Mom did this on purpose?" Margaret paused. "I'm saying the omission had consequences regardless of intent." That was when my mother finally looked at me. Really looked. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she said quietly. "We were trying to keep things simple." I met her gaze. Simple for who? She looked away. The mediator asked if anyone wanted a break. No one did. Margaret laid out the next steps. The trust assets would be frozen pending review. Executor authority would be temporarily suspended. Decisions regarding distribution would require consensus or court intervention. My sister's composure cracked. "This is insane," she said. "She didn't even live here. She barely visited at the end." I felt the old instinct rise. The urge to defend, to list every visit, every call, every quiet moment I had sat beside my grandmother's bed. I didn't say a word. Margaret did. "Frequency of visits is not a legal metric for trustworthiness," she said. "Intent and compliance are." The mediator nodded. At the end of the session, nothing was resolved, but everything had changed. As we stood to leave, my mother reached for my arm. "Can we talk, just us?" I hesitated, then nodded. We stepped into the hallway. Her voice dropped. "You didn't have to do this." I held her gaze. "You didn't have to hide it." She flinched. "I thought I was protecting you," she said. "You've always been sensitive." That was when I understood something I hadn't before. She truly believed that. She believed control was care, that managing outcomes was love, that my autonomy was a liability to be softened, redirected, quietly removed. I stepped back. "I'm not sensitive," I said. "I'm observant." She didn't follow me as I walked away. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table, the mediation papers spread out in front of me. Not because I needed to review them, but because I needed to see the evidence laid flat. Needed to remind myself that this wasn't imagined. This wasn't emotional distortion. This was real. My phone buzzed again, a message from my sister. "You're tearing the family apart." I stared at it for a long time before replying. "No, I'm refusing to be erased." I turned the phone off. The next phase would be slower, quieter, more technical. But the illusion of unity was gone, and in its place was something far more honest. A reckoning that had been delayed for years finally catching up to all of us at once. The days after mediation were deceptively quiet. No angry calls, no dramatic messages, just a strange humming stillness, like the moment after a storm passes, but before you step outside to see what's been damaged. I went back to work, answered emails, cooked dinner, folded laundry. On the surface, my life looked unchanged. Underneath everything was rearranging itself. Margaret called me every few days with updates, short, precise. The trust review had been formally opened. A court-appointed trustee was being considered. My mother's authority as executor remained suspended. Assets were frozen. They couldn't sell the house. They couldn't move money. They couldn't pretend nothing had happened. That mattered more than any confrontation ever could. My family, however, did not handle quiet well. My aunt reached out first, the one who had always spoken in soft, sympathetic tones while repeating whatever narrative my mother set. She left a voicemail heavy with concern. "Your mom is beside herself. She hasn't slept. She keeps saying she doesn't understand why you do this to her." I deleted it. Then came my cousin, the same one who loved gossip when it wasn't her life on display. "You should really think about how this looks. People are talking." I blocked her number. It wasn't anger driving those decisions. It was clarity. Every message carried the same underlying demand: stop making us uncomfortable. I wasn't interested in comfort anymore. A week later, Margaret forwarded me a document that made my breath catch. My grandmother had named me as successor trustee, not immediately, not publicly, only if the original executor failed to comply with the trust's conditions, which she had. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't sentimental. This was strategy. Margaret explained what that meant in practical terms. If the court upheld the clause, I would have legal authority over the trust assets. Not to keep them all, not to punish anyone, to oversee fair distribution according to the trust's terms. My grandmother hadn't wanted chaos. She had wanted accountability. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same family that had always framed me as emotional, reactive, difficult, now faced the reality that I was the one legally empowered to make decisions. They had spent years assuming I wouldn't act. That assumption had become their blind spot. My sister showed up at my workplace 2 days later. I worked in a small nonprofit office, the kind of place where everyone knows each other's coffee order. Seeing her there standing in the lobby with her arms crossed sent a ripple of discomfort through the room. "Can we talk?" she asked. I nodded and stepped outside. She didn't waste time. "You're enjoying this," she said. "You like having power for once." I studied her face, the tension around her mouth, the fear behind the accusation. "No," I said. "I like having truth." She scoffed. "You could end this. You could tell them to drop it." I shook my head. "I don't control the process. I just refuse to lie." That was when her voice cracked. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to Mom?" I kept my tone even. "Do you have any idea what being managed your entire life does to someone?" She didn't answer. She turned and walked away without another word. That night, I opened my grandmother's letter again. Not to search for guidance, but to remember the tone, the steadiness, the quiet confidence. She had known this would hurt. She had chosen to act anyway. That was love in her language. A few days later, the court issued a preliminary finding. The trust would be honored. Executor authority would not be reinstated. Oversight would be transferred. To me, I sat at my kitchen table, the official notice in front of me, and felt the weight of it settle in my chest. Not triumph, responsibility. I called Margaret. "I want to do this cleanly," I said. "No surprises, no retaliation." She smiled through the phone. "That's exactly why you were named." The next step was formal notice. Every beneficiary would be informed of the trust's existence and the revised process. Transparency at last. My mother didn't call when she received hers. My father didn't either. My sister sent one message. "This isn't over." She was right. It wasn't over. But it was no longer theirs to control. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting to see what they would decide next. I was preparing to decide for myself. Being named trustee didn't feel like winning. It felt like standing in a room where everyone had been whispering behind my back for years, and suddenly realizing the lights were on and the doors were locked. Nothing dramatic happened at first. No shouting, no public fallout, just a quiet shift in gravity. The paperwork arrived in waves. Formal notices, asset summaries, legal language stripped of emotion. Margaret walked me through it all with methodical patience, explaining timelines and obligations. I listened carefully, took notes, asked questions. Not because I doubted myself, but because I understood something now that I hadn't before. Power doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. As trustee, I had one obligation above all others: to act in the best interest of the trust and its beneficiaries. Not my parents' comfort, not my sister's expectations, not my own resentment. The truth. That clarity kept me steady. The first meeting was scheduled 2 weeks later. Mandatory attendance for all beneficiaries. Neutral location. No theatrics allowed. Margaret warned me that this would be the moment the family realized the ground had fully shifted. They arrived early. My parents sat together rigid and silent. My sister sat across from them, arms folded, eyes sharp. A few extended relatives hovered at the edges, uncomfortable but curious. Everyone avoided my gaze when I walked in. I took my seat at the head of the table. No one commented on it, but I felt the change ripple through the room. I opened with facts, clear, calm, documented. I explained the trust, its purpose, its conditions, the reason for the review. I did not accuse. I did not explain my feelings. I did not reference the past beyond what was legally relevant. My mother interrupted once. "This is unnecessary," she said. "We could have handled this privately." I met her eyes. Private handling is what caused the problem. She didn't interrupt again. When I finished, the room was quiet, not stunned, not angry, just recalibrating. My uncle spoke first. "So what happens now?" I answered honestly. "Assets will be distributed according to the trust's instructions. Some allocations will change, some will remain the same. No one will be excluded without cause. No one will receive more because of proximity or influence." My sister laughed, sharp and humorless. "So you're the judge now?" I shook my head. "No, I'm the process." That seemed to unsettle her more than any accusation could have. The meeting ended without resolution. But that wasn't the point. The point was establishing reality. Afterward, my mother waited until the others had left before approaching me. "You could have spared us this humiliation," she said quietly. I thought about the word humiliation. How often it had been used to silence me, to keep me small. "This isn't humiliation," I said, "it's consequence." She stared at me as if I were someone she didn't recognize. That night, I sat alone with a glass of water and stared at the trust ledger on my laptop. Numbers, properties, accounts, years of careful planning. My grandmother had built something stable and expected it to be handled with integrity. I intended to honor that. The next weeks were busy: appraisals, consultations, meetings with accountants, every step documented, every decision defensible. And slowly the narrative my family had relied on began to unravel. The house, the one my sister assumed was hers outright, was placed in a holding arrangement. She could remain there temporarily, but ownership would be reviewed. My parents' access to certain funds was restricted pending compliance review. Extended relatives received notices clarifying their roles and limitations. Nothing punitive, just precise. My sister called one evening, her voice raw. "You're ruining everything." I listened without interrupting. "You always do this," she continued. "You take things too far." When she finished, I spoke. "You're angry because the rules apply now." She hung up. A week later, Margaret brought me something unexpected: a supplemental letter. It had been filed with the trust but never referenced by my family's attorney. It outlined my grandmother's reasoning in more detail. Not emotional, practical. She wrote about patterns she had observed, about favoritism disguised as efficiency, about control mistaken for care. She wrote that she feared the family would confuse obedience with harmony. I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about money. This was about rewriting a system that had functioned on silence. The court scheduled a final hearing to confirm trustee authority and approve the distribution plan. By then, the resistance had softened, not because they agreed, but because they understood resistance no longer worked. My father approached me in the hallway that day. "You didn't have to do it this way," he said. I looked at him, really looked at him. The man who had always stood just behind my mother, letting her speak for both of them. "There was no other way," I said. He nodded once slowly. The hearing was brief, procedural. The judge reviewed the documentation, asked a few clarifying questions, and approved the plan. Just like that, it was done. Outside the courthouse, my sister didn't speak to me. My mother looked tired, smaller somehow. My father walked ahead without looking back. I stood there for a moment, the afternoon sun warm on my face, and felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because I had won, but because I had stopped waiting for permission. That night I went home and packed away the letter my grandmother had written. I didn't need to reread it anymore. its work was done. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window watching the streetlights come on one by one. The hardest part wasn't the legal battle. It was accepting that love, when tangled with control, will always demand silence as its price. And I was no longer willing to pay it. After the hearing, the silence changed. Before, it had been heavy, pressurized, full of unsent messages and rehearsed arguments. Now it was thinner, fragile, like something that could shatter if touched too directly. My family stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding and started treating it like a loss they hadn't planned for. They didn't say that out loud. They didn't have to. My sister moved out of the house within 10 days. She didn't tell me she was leaving. I heard it from a neighbor who called to ask if a moving truck was supposed to be blocking the street. I said yes and thanked her. I didn't ask where my sister was going. That was no longer my responsibility. My parents didn't call. They sent emails instead, short, formal, as if we were colleagues who had once worked on a project together and now needed to wrap things up cleanly. Your father and I would like to retrieve a few personal items from the house. Please advise on a time. I replied with dates and instructions, nothing more. Margaret told me this phase was predictable. When people lose control, they don't immediately rage. They reorganize. They look for leverage in smaller places: sentiment, memory, obligation. I stayed steady. The house itself became a kind of symbol. For years, it had been held up as proof of legacy, continuity, belonging. Now it was just a property under review: walls, deeds, appraisals. I walked through it alone one afternoon, clipboard in hand, noting repairs that needed to be made before listing. The rooms echoed differently without furniture, without expectation. In my grandmother's bedroom, I paused by the window where she used to sit every morning, tea in hand, watching the street wake up. I remembered her voice, low and deliberate. People reveal themselves when they think they're in charge. She had been right. The first formal distribution notices went out the following week. Accounts divided, properties assigned, conditions clearly stated, everything documented. No one could claim confusion anymore. My uncle called that night. He sounded tired. I should have said something earlier, he admitted. I knew things weren't right. I didn't respond to that part. What matters now, I said, is that it's done correctly. He agreed. We hung up. That was the pattern now. Conversations without emotional resolution. Closure without comfort. I learned to accept that. Then came the call I hadn't expected. My father. It was late afternoon. I was home sorting through old photographs I planned to donate to a local historical society. The phone rang, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. I answered. He didn't waste time. Your mother's not handling this well, he said. I waited. She feels humiliated, exposed. I leaned back in my chair, the word exposed hanging between us. She made her choices, I said quietly. He sighed, a long, tired sound. She thought she was protecting the family. I closed my eyes. No, I said. She was protecting a structure that worked for her. Silence. He spoke again, slower this time. You've changed. I opened my eyes. No, I said. I stopped compensating. That seemed to land somewhere he hadn't prepared for. We ended the call politely. Afterward, I felt a familiar pull, the urge to check in, to soften the edges, to reach out and reassure. I didn't, because every time I had done that before, it had reset the cycle. Instead, I focused on what was in front of me. The trust work was nearly complete. Final documents needed signatures. Properties needed to be listed, loose ends tied. And then, unexpectedly, something else came up. A letter from my grandmother's bank, dated months before her stroke, addressed to me. It had been forwarded late. Inside was a brief note. If anything becomes complicated, remember this account exists. It's not large, but it's separate. I felt my breath catch. Margaret confirmed it later. A modest account set aside intentionally, not to hide assets, but to ensure I would never be forced into compliance because of financial pressure. She had thought of everything. That realization hit harder than any courtroom moment. This wasn't about winning. It was about being safeguarded in a family system that had never prioritized my independence. The final trustee meeting was uneventful. Documents signed, authority confirmed, end date set. When it was over, Margaret closed her folder and looked at me. Most people in your position would feel vindicated, she said. I considered that. I feel clear, I said. She smiled. That's rarer. On my drive home, I passed the old neighborhood where I grew up. The park where my sister had always been celebrated. The school where my achievements had been footnotes. For years, those places had felt like evidence of what I lacked, of what I'd missed. Now they were just places, memory without obligation. That night, I slept with the windows open, letting the sound of crickets fill the room. I didn't dream about the house or the court or my family. I dreamed about walking forward unencumbered. The next chapter of my life wasn't going to be loud. It wasn't going to be performative. It was going to be deliberate. And for the first time, entirely my own. The first holiday after everything settled arrived quietly. No invitations, no group texts debating menus or arrival times. Just a calendar reminder on my phone that said Thanksgiving and the strange realization that for the first time in my adult life, I was not expected anywhere. At first, that absence felt unsettling, like forgetting something important, like leaving the house without keys. My body kept waiting for the pull of obligation, the familiar dread that always came with long tables and forced gratitude. But it didn't come. Instead, there was space. I decided not to travel. I stayed in my townhouse, cooked a simple meal for myself, and ate at the small table by the window. No centerpiece, no performance, just food that tasted like exactly what it was. Halfway through dinner, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. "Happy Thanksgiving. We hope you're well." No apology, no accusation, just distance wrapped in politeness. I stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone down without replying. That was the moment I understood something clearly. They weren't waiting for reconciliation. They were waiting for compliance. For the version of me who would eventually soften, reach out, smooth things over, restore the balance that made them comfortable. That version of me was gone. The following weeks brought small, unexpected shifts. Invitations I had stopped receiving years ago began appearing again, not from family, but from people I hadn't realized had been watching quietly. A former colleague reached out to collaborate on a project. A neighbor invited me to a small dinner. Even my boss commented offhandedly that I seemed more confident lately. It wasn't confidence. It was alignment. Without the constant pressure to manage my family's expectations, I had energy I didn't know I'd been losing. Decisions felt cleaner. Boundaries felt less like walls and more like structure. Then in early December, Margaret called with one final matter. "There's a personal item listed in the trust that hasn't been addressed," she said. "It wasn't part of the distribution because it wasn't considered an asset." "What is it?" I asked. "A sealed envelope, filed with the trust documents, addressed to you." I felt my chest tighten, not with fear but with recognition. I picked it up from her office later that afternoon. The envelope was familiar. Same handwriting, same careful pressure. I waited until I got home to open it. Inside was a single page. No legal language, no instructions. Just my grandmother's voice, clear and steady. She wrote about watching me grow up in a family that mistook obedience for virtue. About how she admired my restraint, even when it cost me visibility. She acknowledged that stepping forward would feel like betrayal, not because it was wrong, but because it disrupted a system built on silence. Then she wrote the line that stayed with me longest. "They will say you changed. Let them. Change is what happens when you stop accepting what harms you." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. That night, I sat in the dark living room and let myself feel something I hadn't allowed yet. Grief. Not for the inheritance, not for the house. For the family I had believed I could eventually earn my place in. I cried quietly, without drama, without narrative. Just the release of something long held. When it passed, what remained was calm. December moved forward. The house was listed and sold without issue. The final distributions were completed. Accounts closed. The trust dissolved exactly as my grandmother had intended. My role ended, and with it the last formal tie that bound me to the version of my family that had tried to manage me. On Christmas morning, I woke to sunlight filtering through the blinds, and a sense of lightness I hadn't felt before. I made coffee, wrapped myself in a blanket, and sat on the couch listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. No guilt, no expectation, just choice. That afternoon my sister emailed, "No greeting. I still don't agree with how you handled things, but I can't deny you were prepared." I read it twice. Then I archived it, not because it didn't matter, but because I no longer needed acknowledgement to validate my experience. In the days that followed, I began making plans that had nothing to do with repair or resolution. I enrolled in a class I'd been postponing for years. I rearranged my living space. I donated items that no longer felt like mine. I noticed how often before my decisions had been framed around how they would be perceived. Now perception felt irrelevant. The story my family told about me would continue without my participation. They would edit it, soften it, sharpen it, whatever they needed. That was no longer my concern. What mattered was this: I had been placed in a position of power by someone who saw me clearly. I had acted without cruelty. I had held firm without becoming hard, and I had walked away without asking permission. The holiday season ended without a dramatic reunion or final confrontation, just distance. And sometimes distance is the most honest outcome. As the year closed, I stood by my window one last time watching the streetlights flicker on and felt something settle into place. Not victory, not revenge, freedom. The next chapter of my life wasn't about proving anything. It was about choosing myself again and again without apology. The new year did not arrive with fireworks in my life. It arrived quietly the way truth usually does once the noise fades. January mornings were colder than usual. I noticed it when I stepped outside to check the mail breath, visible fingers stiff. The world felt stripped down, honest. Nothing blooming, nothing pretending to be more than it was. I liked it. Without the constant undercurrent of family obligation, my days took on a different rhythm. I woke earlier. I moved slower. I made decisions without rehearsing explanations that would never be asked for. That was when the second consequence of everything began to surface. Not legal, social. My parents started attending the same gatherings again. Book club, church events, neighborhood dinners, and slowly questions followed them. Not direct ones, careful ones. How are things with your daughter? We heard there was some confusion with the estate. Is everything settled now? My mother hated that. She had always curated an image of seamless unity, a family that functioned without friction because friction implied failure. And now, no matter how neatly she spoke, there were cracks she couldn't polish away. I heard about it through others. A friend of a friend, a former neighbor who still talked too much. Apparently I had changed. Apparently I had become difficult. Apparently I had taken advantage of a situation. I didn't correct any of it. I had learned that defending yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you is just another form of surrender. Then one afternoon my father showed up at my door. No call, no warning. I saw his car through the window and felt that familiar tightening in my chest. Not fear, anticipation. I opened the door and waited. He stood there longer than necessary before speaking. Your mother doesn't know I'm here. I stepped aside and let him in. He sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, eyes moving around the room like he was cataloging proof of independence. He looked older than I remembered, smaller. We sat in silence until he finally spoke. She's struggling, he said. I didn't respond. He continued, his voice low. People ask questions. They assume things. She doesn't know how to answer without feeling judged. I met his eyes, and he sighed. She thinks you did this to punish her. That landed exactly where it needed to. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I spoke carefully. I didn't do this to punish anyone. I did it because the truth mattered. He nodded slowly. I believe that. That surprised me. He looked at his hands, but believing it doesn't make it easier. I stood and poured us both water, then sat back down. It was never going to be easy, I said. It was just going to be honest. He didn't stay long after that. Before he left, he paused at the door. You were always stronger than we gave you credit for. I didn't thank him. Strength doesn't need acknowledgement after the fact. In the weeks that followed, something else happened. My sister began to unravel. Not publicly, not dramatically, but the people around her noticed changes. Missed deadlines, short temper, complaints about being overwhelmed. She had always thrived in systems where someone else quietly managed the hard parts. My mother, my grandmother, me. Now there was no one smoothing things out. She called one evening, voice sharp. You've made things harder than they needed to be. I listened. You took something that should have been simple and turned it into a spectacle. I responded calmly. I didn't create the spectacle, I just refused to disappear. She laughed bitterly. You always think you're the victim. That was when I said the thing I'd never allowed myself to say before. I'm not the victim, I said, I'm the witness. She hung up. After that, the call stopped. Spring crept in quietly. The cold eased, trees budded. The world resumed its cycle without consulting anyone. One morning, I found myself standing in a bookstore I used to avoid. It reminded me too much of my grandmother. Her handwriting in the margins, the smell of paper she loved. This time I walked in without flinching. I bought a journal and sat at a cafe nearby, writing without an agenda. No plan, no justification, just observation. That was when I realized the final stage of all of this wasn't legal or emotional. It was internal. For years, I had measured myself against a family narrative I didn't write. I had adjusted my behavior to maintain access. I had confused proximity with belonging. Now I was learning how to exist without being evaluated. That was the real shift. One evening, my mother sent a final message. I don't recognize you anymore. I read it once, Then I replied, "That's because I stopped being who you needed me to be." She didn't respond, and that was all right. Because by then I finally understood something that had taken me decades to accept. You don't lose your family when you set boundaries. You lose the version of them that needed you powerless to feel secure. And that loss, painful as it is, makes room for something far more sustainable: your own life. By the time spring settled in fully, the narrative had shifted again. Not outwardly, not in ways anyone could point to and say, "Here, this is different." But internally, in the spaces where old reflexes used to live, something had finally loosened its grip. I noticed it the first time I made a decision and didn't feel the need to run it through an imaginary panel of judges in my head. It was a small thing. I turned down a promotion at work. For years, I had chased advancement the way people chase safety, believing that if I climbed high enough, if my title sounded impressive enough, my family would finally see me as legitimate, worth listening to, worth respecting. This time I read the offer carefully and declined it without guilt. The role came with prestige, yes, but also long hours, constant travel, and an expectation to be available at all times. Old me would have accepted immediately and figured out how to endure the cost later. Now I asked a different question. Does this serve the life I am building or the approval I no longer need? The answer was clear. My boss was surprised but respectful. She told me she admired my clarity. I thanked her and meant it. That clarity had been hard-earned. Around that same time, I received a notice in the mail. The final closure of the trust. Everything completed. No loose ends. No pending appeals. The legal chapter of my grandmother's life and mine officially closed. I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of me for a long time before opening it. Not because I was anxious, but because I understood what it represented. An ending. I opened it, skimmed the confirmation, and set it aside. No surge of triumph, no wave of sadness, just completion. That night, I dreamed of my grandmother for the first time since her funeral. She was sitting at the small round table in her kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching me with that familiar, steady gaze. "You did fine," she said. I woke up calm. A week later, my sister reached out again. Not by phone, not by email. A handwritten note arrived in the mail. It was brief, tense, carefully worded. "I don't know how to talk to you right now. I don't know if I ever will. But I'm tired of being angry all the time." I read it twice and set it down. I didn't reply. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I finally understood something important. Reconciliation requires two people willing to see the same truth. We weren't there. And forcing it would only recreate the same imbalance I had just dismantled. A few days later, my mother tried one last approach. She sent an invitation. A family dinner. Neutral location. Public enough to keep things civil. I stared at the message for a long time. The old version of me would have gone. Would have dressed carefully. Would have prepared measured responses. Would have swallowed discomfort for the sake of appearing reasonable. This time I declined politely. "I'm not ready for that. I wish you well." She replied almost immediately. "I don't understand why you won't let this go." I typed my response slowly. Because letting it go without acknowledging it is how it happened in the first place. I didn't hear from her after that. And something surprising happened. I didn't miss the noise. Instead, my life began to fill with quieter, sturdier things. Friendships that didn't require performance, evenings that weren't tense, decisions that felt aligned instead of reactive. I started volunteering at a local organization that worked with women navigating family estrangement. Not to tell my story, but to listen. To witness others grappling with the same realization I had come to too late in life. That love without respect is not love. That loyalty demanded through guilt is not loyalty. That family systems resist change not because it's wrong, but because it threatens comfort. One afternoon, after a long shift, I sat alone in my car and realized something else. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at my mother. Not at my sister. Not even at my father. Anger had been useful. It had fueled movement. But it had done its job. What remained was something steadier. Self-trust. I trusted my perceptions now, my instincts, my memory. No one could rewrite my reality without my consent. That was the real inheritance. The last conversation I had with my father happened by accident. We ran into each other at the grocery store. Same aisle, same shelf of canned soup we both liked. He looked startled to see me. We exchanged small talk, weather, traffic, nothing of substance. Before we parted, he hesitated. "I hope you're happy," he said. I considered the question honestly. "I'm peaceful," I said. "That's better." He nodded slowly, as if committing the answer to memory. As I walked away, I didn't feel the old ache, the longing for acknowledgement. I felt finished, not closed off. finished negotiating my worth. The hardest truth of all had finally settled into place. You don't heal by being understood. You heal by understanding yourself well enough to stop explaining. And with that understanding, the final chapter of my old life quietly came to an end. The thing no one tells you about walking away from a toxic family system is that the silence afterward isn't empty. It's instructional. Once the chaos stops, you begin to notice how much of your identity was shaped in reaction to other people's moods. How often your thoughts were interrupted by imaginary objections. How many decisions were delayed because you were waiting for someone else's approval, even after you told yourself you weren't. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, unglamorous moments, standing in the grocery store and choosing what I wanted without calculating who might comment on it, letting a call go to voicemail without panic, saying no without cushioning it in explanations. Each moment felt minor. Together they rewired something fundamental. By early summer, the estate no longer occupied any part of my daily life. The paperwork was complete, the funds distributed, the house sold to a couple who planned to raise their children there. I drove past it once by accident and felt nothing but a distant gratitude. It had served its purpose. So had I. What surprised me was how my body reacted to peace. At first, I was exhausted, bone-tired in a way sleep didn't fix. Margaret had warned me about this. When you leave a prolonged state of vigilance, your nervous system crashes. It finally stops bracing. I took time off work. Not to travel or reinvent myself, but to rest. I walked in the mornings. I read in the afternoons. I let days pass without needing them to prove anything. That was when the dreams started. Not dramatic ones, not confrontational, just memories surfacing without urgency. A younger version of me sitting at the edge of a family gathering listening. A quiet dinner with my grandmother, no agenda, just presence. Moments I had survived by shrinking now replayed without fear. I wasn't reliving them. I was integrating them. One afternoon, I received an unexpected email from the nonprofit's board. They were restructuring leadership and wanted to know if I would consider stepping into a strategic role. Not a promotion in title, but in influence, policy, direction. Old instincts stirred. The urge to ask what they expected. The urge to ensure I could meet invisible standards. I paused. Then I asked the question I'd learned to trust. What authority comes with this role? The answer was clear, defined, respectful. I accepted. Not because it would impress anyone, but because it aligned with how I wanted to work now, with integrity, with boundaries, without being managed through ambiguity. Around that same time, my sister tried once more. She sent a longer email this time, less sharp, more reflective. She acknowledged that she had benefited from being protected, that she hadn't understood how much had been handled for her until it stopped. She didn't apologize, but she didn't attack either. I read it carefully. Then I replied with 2 sentences. I appreciate your honesty. I'm not ready to rebuild anything yet. She wrote back simply. I understand. That was progress, not reconciliation, but accountability. My mother, on the other hand, went quiet completely. No messages, no updates, no attempts to reframe the story. I heard through others that she had leaned heavily into routine, church, volunteer work, the version of herself that existed best when she was admired for her sacrifice. I didn't resent her for it, but I no longer participated. Late one evening, as summer storms rolled in, I found myself sitting on the floor of my living room, sorting through a box of old photos. I hadn't planned to keep them, but as I flipped through, I realized something unexpected. There were pictures of me smiling, not posed, not performative, real. They weren't frequent, but they existed. Proof that even in the years when I felt unseen, I had still been myself. That mattered. I kept a few photos, returned the rest to the box, and labeled it clearly. Not for hiding, for closure. The final moment came quietly. A call from Margaret just checking in. You've done well, she said. Most people never fully step out of the roles their families assign them. I smiled. I didn't step out, I said. I declined to keep performing. She laughed softly. That's even harder. After we hung up, I sat by the window and watched the rain streak down the glass. I thought about all the times I had confused endurance with strength, silence with maturity, compliance with love. I thought about how close I had come to disappearing without ever realizing it. And I understood something clearly, something I wish I had learned earlier. You don't owe access to people who refuse to see you. You don't owe peace to systems that require your absence to function. You don't owe loyalty to control. The life I was living now wasn't louder, it wasn't more impressive, but it was honest. And honesty, once you claim it, becomes non-negotiable. The last chapter wasn't about closure with them. It was about commitment to myself. And I was ready to make it permanent. I didn't mark the anniversary. No calendar alert, no quiet ritual, no moment of reflection planned in advance. The day passed the way most meaningful changes do, unnoticed, until you realize you are standing on different ground. It was a Tuesday. Ordinary. I woke early, made coffee, and sat at the small table by the window while the city stirred awake. Cars passed. A dog barked. Someone laughed on the sidewalk below. Life moved forward without waiting for acknowledgement. That was the point. For most of my life, I had measured progress by reaction, by whether someone approved, by whether silence followed or punishment arrived, by whether I was still allowed inside the room. Now the measure was simpler. Was I at peace with my choices? The answer was yes. I hadn't spoken to my mother in months. Not out of anger, not out of strategy, just distance that no longer required explanation. My sister and I exchanged the occasional neutral message, usually about logistics or shared acquaintances. We existed in parallel, now no longer orbiting the same center. My father sent a short note once, no apology, just a line that said, "I hope you're doing well." I believed him, and that was enough. The space that opened where my family used to dominate my thoughts didn't stay empty for long. It filled with things that were quieter but sturdier, work that felt aligned, friendships built on mutual respect instead of tolerance, even solitude that felt chosen, not imposed. One evening, I hosted a small dinner, nothing formal, just a few people who knew me in the present tense. We ate, talked, laughed. No one asked me to summarize my past or justify my boundaries. No one needed me to be smaller to feel secure. At some point, someone asked how I learned to be so calm under pressure. I thought about it before answering. I stopped negotiating my reality, I said. That was the truth. The real revenge was never the legal outcome. It was never the exposure or the discomfort my family felt when their narrative unraveled. Those were consequences, not goals. The revenge was this: I no longer reacted. I didn't chase understanding from people invested in misunderstanding me. I didn't perform gratitude for scraps of approval. I didn't explain my boundaries to people who benefited from violating them. I chose clarity over harmony. I chose dignity over access. I chose myself without spectacle, without cruelty, without asking permission. That choice changed everything. Months later, I visited my grandmother's grave for the first time since everything ended. I stood quietly, hands in my pockets, reading her name carved into stone. I didn't talk out loud. I didn't need to. I felt her presence not as memory, but as structure. The way her foresight had held me steady when the ground shifted. The way her trust had given me something my family never did: authority over my own life. As I turned to leave, a thought settled into me, simple and unshakable. Some families don't lose you because you walk away. They lose you because they never learned how to stand beside you without trying to own you. That wasn't bitterness, it was acceptance. I drove home with the windows down, letting the evening air wash through the car. The road ahead was open, unmarked by obligation or expectation, just choice. If there is one thing I know now, it's this: being excluded taught me where I never belonged. Taking my power back taught me where I always did. And if you are reading this and recognize yourself in it, if you have been made small by the people who were supposed to protect you, if love in your life has come with conditions you never agreed to, remember this: you don't owe silence to survive. You don't owe obedience to be loved. You don't owe access to anyone who treats your dignity like a negotiation. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop arguing, stop explaining, and quietly take your life back. That is not cruelty. That is integrity. And integrity, once chosen, is the kind of revenge that lasts. If this story resonated with you, tell me where you're listening from and what choosing yourself has cost you or saved you.